All right.
All right, welcome everybody, and thank you so much, Adam, for jumping on today. I would like to welcome Adam Smithline. Adam is an entrepreneur with experience in mobile software, internet, IoT, SaaS companies. He has also done a ton of work in product strategy, marketing, e-commerce, analytics, and he's going to tell us about the story of growing Wayzn. So, Adam, the floor is yours. I'm going to go ahead and drop it off to you.
Thanks, Danny. Welcome, everybody. My name's Adam Smithline. As Danny mentioned, I'm a fairly recent product development person. I co founded a company called Wayzn. We make technology that lets you do things like open doors and windows and other things remotely without having to be present. Today, I'm going to talk about our product journey and some of the guiding principles that we use, which I'd like to summarize as just enough product development. Uh, Bear with me during the presentation as I may have to start and stop sharing my slides a couple of times due to some technical challenges around making sure that you can hear the correct audio. So with that, I'm going to start sharing. If you just give me one moment.
Hey Adam, I am not hearing your audio, but I will check if that's a our end.
Now you'll have to forgive me. I hit the wrong setting. See, we're already having technical difficulties. So let me try and share that one more time with the correct setting.
No problem. This is a lot of fun, and it's a interesting environment. So
All
this
right.
happens.
You can still hear me.
Perfect. We can hear you
Okay.
now.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Yeah, thank you, Danny. So the experts say the secret to a good talk is not to have technical difficulties. No, is to tell a story. Uh, I figure if one story is good, then two stories must be better. So that's what you're going to get today. As expected, you're going to hear the story of Wayzn's product journey, how we started, how we developed our first product, and how we got to where we are today. But first, I'd like to tell you a different story. Let's call this the story of the great ideas that failed, sort of. This is a tale of how some smart people with some good ideas spent some serious money trying to bring those ideas to market only to fail time and again. And this also happens to be my personal story. In 1992, I finished my undergrad business degree and started my professional career. And I was just as green as could be. And I flubbed all my interviews with all the great management consulting firms that were hiring at my school. And eventually, I found a job working for a company that had an amazing idea. And it turns out it was a startup. And I would be working north of 80 hours a week trying to make this idea a reality. The idea was to save people a trip to the video store by delivering videos directly to the home. So if you're thinking that sounds a lot like how Netflix got started, you'd be right. But that wouldn't happen for another 6 years. The company I worked for was called Murphy's Express. It had a few locations throughout the Bay Area, and this was before home internet access. So we printed a huge paper catalog, and one of our drivers would drop it off at your house. When you wanted a video, you would call our landline from your landline and place your order. And less than 2 hours later, your video would be delivered or your rental was free. It was actually a really great idea. But the model had a tremendous amount of overhead and just way too much friction. So, despite our best efforts, we did not achieve commercial success fast enough to survive. But of course, the idea didn't fail, just the company failed. A few years later, Netflix made it work by tweaking the model to leverage the internet, DVDs, and the postal service. And this made Netflix a huge company and gave them enough capital to eventually pivot into the leading video streaming service we all subscribe to today. Fast forward a little bit, undeterred, in 1995, I joined another startup. It was the darling of Silicon Valley and had raised some venture capital with another brilliant idea. The plan was to bring personalized news, sports scores, and stock information into your home and onto your computer. Yeah, it sounds like something your phone can do today, but in 1995, we were just hearing the term web browser for the very first time. A lot of companies were working on this idea, including AOL, Yahoo, but the company I worked for was not one of these. It was called Pointcast. Pointcast had some pretty fancy screensaver software that connected to the internet and retrieved information tailored to your specific interests. Unfortunately, Pointcast ran into problems with corporate IT departments because their software was a bandwidth hog. It turns out that using the internet requires bandwidth, something we all have plenty of today. But in the 90s, bandwidth was really hard to come by, and companies paid a fortune for something called a T1 line so they could have it. And they protected that bandwidth at all costs. So IT departments eventually lost their battle with web browsing out of the workplace, but they won their battle to crush Pointcast. So one minute Pointcast was receiving and turning down generous buyout offers from News Corp and other companies, and the next minute it was belly up. But once again, even though the company failed, the idea became the basis for some of the most visited websites, including MyExcite and MyYahoo. Fast forward a little bit more, in 1998, shortly after Pointcast failed, I joined some XPoint casters at another venture-backed startup. And once again, the idea would change the world. The company developed the technology to synchronize your contacts, photos, and files from all your devices to the cloud. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, it couldn't be Apple because this was 3 years before the iPod was released and 9 years before the very first iPhone. And of course, you'd be right. At the time, Apple stock was trading for $3 per share, and no one I knew was going to work for them. Ah, how times have changed. But how about Google? Google has the same technology. However, Google wouldn't even incorporate until later that year. And Google Drive wouldn't be launched until 2012, more than a decade later. No, the company I joined was called FusionOne. Their technology did the exact same thing. Unfortunately, at that time, almost no one had a need for it. No one had a camera on their phone yet, and no one wanted any of their stuff sitting in something called the cloud. So, despite a huge amount of financial backing and world class technology, FusionOne went out of business. But not before investing $30 million in an advertising campaign that gave us this lasting memento. And if you'll bear with me for one moment, I've got to change my sharing again so that you can hear the commercial.
How you doing?
Okay, hon, what can I get you today?
Sync is everything. FusionOne.
There you have it. FusionOne. You've never heard of them, and their technology is used today by every single one of you. Uh, Sorry, technical difficulties here.
No problem. No problem.
All right. So, why have I chosen to tell you this story? It's certainly not to emphasize my really poor employment choices or the fact that if I took all my money in 1997 and bought Apple stock, I would have been able to retire a few years later. The reason I'm telling you this story is actually to make the simple point that it doesn't matter how great your idea is. Companies with ideas that are too good to fail can still fail. It happens all the time. Murphy's Express, Pointcast, FusionOne, Webvan, Pets.com, Ask Jeeves, WebTV, MP3.com, the list just goes on. These companies all had great ideas. The path to where we are today is paved by the failures of these companies. Companies with really good ideas, ideas that are probably better than the ideas we're all working on today. All right, Danny, I'm just going to check and make sure, is the screen showing okay?
No, we're not seeing the screen, but we're hearing and seeing you
All
fine.
right, hold on. Sorry about that. I'm going to
No
try
problem.
this one more time.
There we go. We're good now. Or let me know if you're. We're not hearing the audio yet.
Please forgive me. I clicked the wrong thing again.
No worries. No worries.
All
Thank
right,
you.
here we go. All right, we're back.
Yes, we're good to go.
So, thank you for bearing with me. So now you understand my perspective. It's formed from years of failure. These experiences shaped my thinking. I believe that we're all trying to accomplish something very difficult, building new products and new companies. It's super hard. Things will inevitably go wrong. And even if your idea is amazing and perfectly timed, it will still take more time and money than you think. You may create something amazing that lots of people love and still never really achieve true product market fit or commercial success. So, if I had to sum this up in a few words, I would say you are in a race. If you only take away one thing from everything I say today, this is probably the thing to remember. When you start working on a new product, the clock starts immediately. And I'm not talking about the race against the competition. This race is against time and money. In order to succeed, you need to find enough product market fit to become self sustaining before your bank account runs dry. All those companies with great ideas that failed did so for the same reason. They simply ran out of money. Okay, so here's the bonus section you weren't expecting, kind of an intermission. Before I go into the Wayzn product development story, I want to take a minute to talk about some ideas we think are really helpful to help kind of level the odds. Please pardon my silly analogy here, but if as product developers we're running in a race, then we're going to need to go out and get the best gear we can find to give us a chance of winning. To help avoid the agony of defeat, Wayzn has found some gear we really like. And this gear could include tools, methods, frameworks for decision making, or anything else that helps you win. I'm sure there's lots of examples of good gear out there, and you probably already have your own way of working that you like. But for what it's worth, here's our list. It includes just enough product development, lean, jobs to be done, and story branding. And it's worth mentioning that these frameworks aren't perfect. They have some overlap, and they may mean different things to you than they mean to me. So we pick and choose how best to apply each one in practice. And of course, this may look really different for someone else, for you or anyone else. So just enough product development. I first heard the idea of just enough in a great book that had absolutely nothing to do with product development. It's called Just Enough Project Management. And the basic idea is that if you don't do enough project management, your project will be at risk of failure because things won't go as planned. And if you do too much project management, you risk slowing down the process and driving everyone crazy. In other words, think of project management as a necessary evil and try to do it as efficiently as possible. You need to find the balance. So, product development is different, of course, because unlike project management, the natural tendency for product development is not to do too little, it's to do too much. But at this same idea of finding balance still applies. So, for product development, we would say at any given time, we need to do just enough product development to keep the ball rolling, but not so much that we put ourselves at unnecessary financial risk. To me, this is super important. I find it really helpful to think of this concept as an equation. Before you spend each and every dollar on product development, ask yourself, are you getting an equally valuable amount of risk reduction? Even if your bank account is flush with venture capital money today, it's still a finite resource. So if you start spending money inefficiently, you create risk instead of reducing it. It's a basic concept, but it's easy to forget in the heat of battle. I personally suggest tattooing it on your co-founder's forehead if they will go for it. Mine declined, but it never hurts to ask. The second guiding principle or piece of gear we use is lean. The concept comes initially from manufacturing, and it was developed in practice by Toyota way back in the 50s. But more recently, a guy named Steve Blank adapted the same ideas to startups, suggesting early stage companies should focus less on product development and more on customer development. He wrote a book, written several, but he wrote a book called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany: Successful Strategies for Products That Win. And in it, he introduces a methodology for learning about customers and their problems as early in the development process as possible. Steve teaches us that we don't know what product the customer wants. And even more importantly, the customer themselves doesn't know what they want. And lastly, that the best way to find out is to develop and test hypotheses as quickly as possible. So, in other words, don't spend money building a product no one wants. Also, tattoo worthy, I think. So, the lean approach relies on something called the MVP, or the minimum viable product. I put the word product in quotes to differentiate it from the real actual product you will eventually ship. That may also be an MVP, as it was in our case. Um, once hypo- uh, One hypothesis requires one experiment, and the MVP is what you build to run each test. It may be a drawing on a piece of paper, or some lines of code, or an app mockup, or a physical prototype. It's really whatever it takes to test your hypothesis. So the MVP should be the simplest, cheapest version of the product or product component that you can put in front of a customer to get their response, learn something, and move forward. You'll have to use your creativity here. Um, for example, when we were developing a pet tag that opens a door, we had to simulate the behavior of the dog because it wasn't practical to use an actual dog to run hundreds of tests. So that's the learn, build, measure cycle. And you can think of each of these cycles as a mini race or a sprint. And at the end of each sprint is a gate. And when you pass through the gate, you begin a new sprint. So just try to break the product development process into the smallest possible sprints that you can, and make sure that each time you pass through a gate, it reduces the overall risk to your business in some measurable way. This can be a little bit confusing, so I think it's helpful to have an analogy here. Let's say, for example, you wanted to climb Mount Shasta. So your goal is to be able to summit Mount Shasta and survive to talk about it. And frankly, I can tell you based on personal experience, if you just jumped in your car today and drove to Mount Shasta, there's little chance you're going to accomplish this goal. In order to succeed, you're going to need to have a permit. You'll have to have the right gear, and you'll need to know how to use it, and you'll have to have the right supplies with you. When you get there, you need to know the route you're going to take up the mountain and how to find it. And let's not forget, you need to be in pretty good physical shape and you need good weather. So, the gates you have to pass through, and each one is well defined, and it's a good gate if by clearing it, your risk of failure decreases, your odds of success increase. So, lean teaches us that after each sprint, we must measure and learn. But what then? What do we do with the new information we've gathered? Do we simply develop a new hypothesis and start again? Well, maybe. But this is the time to stop and take stock. So at Wayzn, we spend a lot of time taking stock, and frankly, we spend a lot of time talking about the bad news, the things that didn't work out the way we thought they would, and um, we we ask ourselves a ton of questions when we get bad news. It's natural to ask, why did you get the results that you did? But that in itself isn't even enough. Um, we also need to constantly ask ourselves, oops, my bad, please stand by. We also need to constantly ask ourselves if we should even be moving forward. And this is really hard to do because at each stage in the product journey, you have so much more invested that the idea of stopping seems kind of unfathomable. And we're all susceptible to this line of thinking, and it's really the sunk cost fallacy. Time and money already invested can't be recovered, it's gone. So when taking stock, the only cost we should concern ourselves with is actually opportunity cost. We need to determine if it's worth the time and money to move forward, or if that effort could be better spent elsewhere. Where is the best use of the next sprint? Are we steadily reducing risk? Are our underlying assumptions maybe wrong? Are we reducing risk fast enough? Is it time to pivot? Should I be working on my resume? Those are the questions we need to ask. The next piece of gear that we use is something called jobs to be done. And this is a framework that was introduced by a guy named Anthony Olwick in the 90s. So it's much more recent. It was originally called something called outcome-driven innovation. And the basic idea is that when a person finds himself in any specific situation, they may naturally desire to take certain steps to change their situation and make progress toward a new situation. So where lean teaches us that neither we nor the customer know what product they really want, jobs to be done actually teaches us that instead of even focusing on the product, we should focus on the progress the customer is trying to achieve. In other words, we need to learn what future state the customer wants to experience. This is the job they're hiring a product to fill. So once we understand that, we can work backwards from there to develop the innovation that will make their progress possible. And when we wear a product hat, it's easy to get caught in the cycle of adding features and complexity without thinking too much about it. It's fun to build, love to build a product. But jobs theory helps remind us that the customer doesn't care about features. They only care about outcomes. One of the key concepts in jobs theory is something called importance. And you're not going to be able to get hired for every job, but every product you develop will solve multiple jobs depending on the customer who's buying it. So it's necessary to understand what jobs you are competing for, your product is competing for, and how important each of those jobs is to your company. At Wayzn, we survey customers often, and we have learned what jobs they're hiring our smart pet door to accomplish. We learned that our customers hire it most often so they can have the freedom to come and go anytime. At Wayzn, jobs theory is pretty valuable. It shapes our primary research, it shapes the scope of our products, and it informs how we position Wayzn and our products to customers, press, and investors. Last but not least, the fourth piece of gear I want to mention is something called story branding, and this is the newest addition to our gear bag. The idea of story branding was introduced in 2017 by Donald Miller, but the idea goes back pretty far. I think Joseph Campbell wrote a book in the 40s called The Hero's Journey that covers a lot of the same concepts. And Miller's insight is that people love a good story, and Hollywood has figured out the formula. So marketers will really benefit from using Hollywood style storytelling techniques when promoting products and companies. He reminds us that we are part of the customer's story, not the other way around. And he emphasizes that the customer, not our product, is the hero in the story. It sounds simple, but it goes against our natural instinct, which is to boast about how amazing our products are. So you might be asking yourself, why am I going on and on about marketing in a product development session? And the reason is that I believe marketing is as important to product success as any other element of the product, possibly more. We tested the story branding approach, and I want to share the results with you. When we rewrote the copy on our smart pet door product page using story branding, the conversion rate went from 1% to 5%. So, in the race to reach product market fit, where product sales are how we measure success, good marketing may be the difference between success and failure. All right, that's the theory. So, now we'll look at how we attempted to apply it during our product development journey at Wayzn. I compare the experience of developing the Wayzn Smart Pet Door to Mr. Toad's Wild Ride at Disneyland. You're going one direction, and as soon as you start to adjust and things come into focus, you're yanked in an entirely new direction with only a vague idea of where you're headed or when you'll arrive. In the interest of time, I'm going to stick to just the highlights here. I've condensed a lot of smaller sprints into what you could say were the kind of big phases or meta sprints. Um, and you may be surprised to see here that the shipping sprint actually came in the middle of the process, and I'll touch more on that in a minute. So, like all the best stories, ours begins on a winter night with fresh snow falling in the Sierra Nevada mountains. My brother-in-law Mike and I decided at the last minute to do a quick ski trip because powder, and we had to scramble to find boarding for our dogs, which turned out to be quite expensive. After skiing all day, we came back to the cabin and were relaxing in front of the fire with a few drinks, and the topic of boarding the dogs came up, and we were just kind of lamenting. It was a huge bummer. Um, we knew we needed a way to take short trips like these and leave the dogs at home, but our wives were not about to give us the green light to punch holes in the wall and install dog doors, not to mention they're ugly, poorly insulated, and not very secure. So the problem quickly became clear. Our patio doors were really relics of the past. They couldn't do what we wanted. They couldn't open themselves or open on command. And this was 2018. We already had light bulbs we could control with our phones. So why couldn't we use those same phones to open the door? And what if we could? Not only could we go skiing, but we could also stay in bed on cold mornings instead of getting up to let the dog out. And we could be watching TV and let the dog out without getting up from the couch. So the more we talked about it, the more we liked the idea. And surprisingly, when we told our wives, they didn't think we were crazy. So we told some friends, and friends with relevant experience, no less, and they actually said encouraging things. So people even told us that, they would use it if it existed. But we researched it and it didn't. So without even thinking much about it, we just bought some off the shelf parts. And in a few days, we cobbled together a sliding door opener that you could operate with a handheld fob remote control. And once we saw something working, however crudely, we got really excited. We thought that this technology, if we built it, may have some value. But then reality started to creep in. We were talking about changing a part of the home that has resisted change for a long time. And we'd also be trying to change consumer behavior. And we were talking about developing an entirely new product category. And on top of all that, there were other inconvenient facts. Namely, at the time, we both had other companies we were trying to build, and we had little free time. Um, Not to mention, between the two of us, we actually had zero experience with hardware or IoT. The closest I had come was building an electric skateboard with my son. So we knew it was crazy to push forward. There was no denying the enthusiasm everyone expressed for the idea, but this was not an easy decision. So we decided to do it. But if we were going to proceed further, we'd need money. And in order to raise money, even from our personal networks, we were going to need to show them something better than the pile of store-bought parts sitting in the living room. So we decided to risk a small amount of time and money to build a proof of concept that we could use to gather feedback and maybe try to get some funding. And this became our first major sprint. Our hypothesis was that when people saw the idea in action, they would get excited enough to give us money. In other words, the gate was going to be raising cash, and if we didn't pass the gate, there was nothing else to discuss. This was a period of rapid discovery and innovation, and during this time, we identified the key features the product would need to have in order for us to be able to use it in our homes. It needed to be small, it needed to be easy to install, it needed to be easy to disengage in case you lost power and needed to exit. And of course, it needed to be safe. We used Arduino and hobbyist parts to build something that could send power to a linear actuator when motion was detected. I'd never even used a breadboard before, and I didn't study software engineering in school, so the internet was my best friend throughout this process. And yes, if you're wondering, that is a toilet paper tube. We used it to limit the field of view of the passive infrared motion detector. All right, so hopefully you're seeing this video. Is it loading? Danny, can you see the video?
It is loading currently.
All right, well, let's hope it loads. Well, you may not be able to see the video. Oh, you're going to see the video. Maybe not. Well, that's a bummer. Technical difficulties. I do apologize. I'm not sure why it's not loading. Anyway, what you're supposed to be seeing is a video of the first working proof of concept. You can see it there in the corner. It took a few months of trial and error to find solutions to each new challenge as it came up, but eventually we had a working system. This version used a photon microprocessor from Particle, and that gave us the Wi-Fi connectivity without much work. And it also gave us access to a very basic mobile app that we could use to send commands from the phone to the device. And this video, which I swear would be awesome if you could see it, we showed it around, and as we'd hoped, people really liked it, and we were able to use it to start raising some money. I just can't seem to get it to run for you, so I apologize for that. Let's see if we can move to the next screen. All right. Can you still hear me and see the screen at least?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay. So at this point, we were feeling on top of the world, because in that video, you would have seen the dog walk up to the door and the door open for it, and the dog let itself out, which was pretty cool. We built that and we felt great about it, and we demonstrated it could work, and we had a little investment coming in. But we still had our other companies, and we literally had no idea what it would take to bring this thing to market. So we made an effort to find out. We researched and met with a number of firms that could help us develop our rough POC into an actual product. One thing we learned was it was going to cost a lot more money than we had expected. And there were other questions we couldn't quite answer yet, like could we make it safe enough? And could we make a profit on it? And will anyone even buy it? So that takes us to our next meta sprint, and we'll call this one Looks Like, Works Like. So as the euphoria from building the POC wore off and the likely cost of actually building a product sank in, we started thinking about ways we could answer some of those critical questions that we still had. Of course, we could blindly march forward and just start building the product, but I was determined not to repeat the mistakes of my past. We wanted to take baby steps and reduce our risk of failure. The most important thing we figured we had to know was if anyone that would actually buy it. We needed a way to measure demand, and we realized that a crowdfunding campaign would let us try to sell the product before it was actually built. So this process took over 6 months, working every available minute. We hired a firm to help with the initial mechanical engineering and industrial design, and we didn't have time or money to do any real electrical or computer engineering for this phase. So we knew we would just have to rely on the guts of the POC that I had built for the time being. During this time, we started to adapt our earlier concepts, and we started to CAD and 3D print parts. And we tested a variety of designs using surveys until we arrived at a design that met with strong approval. Ironically, this was largely a process of taking what the designers gave us and simplifying and removing all of their fancy design elements until we had a product that didn't stand out at all and more or less disappeared into the door. We spent a lot of time on the particular problem of making it fit into the door. This required a variety of innovations, including multiple custom adapters, in addition to the software work that would come later, so the device could learn the door and adjust its power and stroke length according to the door. And while product development was progressing, we had to simultaneously give some attention to marketing. We had a lot riding on this campaign, and we took a decision to spend significantly on the marketing. Our reasoning was that if the goal was to use the campaign to measure demand, then we had to give the campaign every chance of succeeding. In other words, if it ended up failing, we wanted to know for sure that it had failed because the idea itself was unpopular, not because we dropped the ball on marketing. So we hired an agency to help us, and we got to work on building a lead list and producing the assets we'd need for the campaign. At first, we entertained the idea of positioning the product as a smart door, but this had some downsides. Namely, at the time, no one was shopping for something called a smart door. The category just didn't exist. So sticking with the pet door idea made more sense because we could compete head to head with traditional dog doors and the new crop of automatic dog doors that were just starting to appear on the market. And this is when we started trying to figure out what job the product was really doing for customers. One of our early investors suggested that the idea of freedom, and it turned out to be a really good suggestion that's held up through all of our later customer survey work. With the help of some 3D printing and polishing and paint, we eventually arrived at something that looked and worked a lot like we expected the final product would. And with that, we could finally start shooting a commercial, finish the campaign page, and run the campaign. I'm going to try and share the ad with you here too, which may or may not work, but give me 1 second and we'll find out.
This is your dog. This is your life. And this
Perfect.
is your life with your pet made a whole lot easier with Wayzn, a device that converts your sliding back door into a secure app-controlled pet door. So while mom's at work and dad's, well, busy, Wayzn puts the power of using the sliding door into the paws of your pets. No more expensive sitters, no more interruptions, no more accidents in the house, no more worries. Traditional pet doors are ugly, cause permanent damage, and are a serious security hazard. Wayzn just takes 3 minutes to install, working with standard sliding doors of all sizes. No damage, no costly professional installation, no eyesore. And it acts as a secure lock to your home, easily disappearing whenever you need it to. Wayzn detects your pet at the door and sends a notification to your phone when they want out. In case you can't use your phone right away, you have the auto open option, doing the work for you. You can also communicate with your smart speakers, just in case your hands are tied. Locked out? No need for a hide key. Wayzn allows you to get into your home with your smartphone. Wayzn's safe, affordable, and secure, keeping your day's schedule on track while bringing freedom to you and your pet. Learn more today at wayzn.com.
All right, there you have the commercial. And I got to start sharing one more time with the correct audio. Here we go. And it's going to fight me. Okay,
All right.
so
Perfect.
how did it do? So 60 days later, we had our answer. Our campaign only generated $200,000, but even that modest amount of success actually made it an outlier on Indiegogo, put it in the top 10th of the top percent of all technology-related campaigns to date. So it wasn't what we hoped for, but it actually did exceed the benchmark that we had set for ourselves internally. So once again, we had to take stock, and with so much on the line, this was really the point of no return. So we thought long and hard about what to do. On the one hand, the experiment was, quote unquote, a success, and now we had some money to work with. But at the time, we didn't realize it wouldn't be nearly enough to build the product. We thought maybe naively that it would be. On the other hand, we also had a whole new set of questions. So at the urging of the agency, we'd priced the product at nearly half of what we would need to charge going forward in order to have a sustainable gross margin. So we had no idea if customers would pay 2 times that amount for the privilege of not getting up off the couch. In addition, the mechanical design wasn't finished, and we hadn't even begun the electrical design. So that meant we didn't have a BOM, and therefore we only had a rough idea what it was going to cost to make one unit. Worst of all, we still hadn't selected a sensor for the motion detector, and we hadn't written the firmware, so we didn't know for sure if it could be safe. And we were going to be closing doors remotely. So if it wasn't safe, we couldn't move forward. We wouldn't want any part of that. So our decision really was, should we return the money to our Indiegogo backers and tell all our friends and family investors that it was a total loss and go back to our day jobs? Or should we press on? So maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was ego, maybe it was sunk cost talking, but we decided that we owed it to ourselves and to dogs everywhere to at least answer the safety question. I'm going to roll that into the next chunk of work, which we'll call shipping the MVP. So things got a lot more complicated really, really fast. We had to use every resource we could now to help us determine what we could do to even reduce risk. Once again, we set out to try to answer the remaining questions that we had, and new questions started popping up basically every day. The time for baby steps was over, and we had pre-orders that we didn't even know if we were going to be able to fill, because we didn't even know if the product was viable. So we put all the effort we had into trying to pass the "is it safe" gate as fast as we could. I don't think you're going to be able to see this video, so I'm just going to move on if it will let me. But the story here is we tried a bunch of different sensors and different approaches, and finally we arrived at the point where we couldn't be 100% sure, but we felt pretty confident that it could be done safely. So this is just a video of the dog letting itself out, and then me standing in the doorway as the door closes on me without consequence. It just opens back up. So we had crossed the safety gate in our minds, and now all we had to do was finish a few remaining items to get it built. So how hard could that be? And if you're developing a product, then you already know the answer to this question. Super, super hard. It turns out that we had an overwhelming amount of work remaining: mechanical, electrical, industrial, systems, firmware, appware, plastic, packaging, fulfillment, and more. It was just daunting. And to make things even more interesting, just a few months into this period, we were invited to pitch on Shark Tank. So, of course, we were super flattered, and we had visions of showing the world how amazing Wayzn was. But unfortunately, we were nowhere near ready to show our product on national television. We should have firmly declined the invitation. But here, another mistake. We knew the exposure was priceless. This was our big chance to launch Wayzn. So we said yes. And that meant we had to stop everything else and scramble to build some fake version of the product that we could show on television. It would be super simple, almost softwareless, basically another prototype that could do the most basic functions. And for several months, we spent heavily and rushed development and cut corners and made sacrifices on the product as we went through rounds of discussion and contracts and planning for filming. We were really stressing because this was hurting the overall product development effort, and it was starting to look like we wouldn't even be ready on time to meet the filming deadline. Then, just weeks before we were to travel to LA, they cut us from the docket with no explanation. It was a huge letdown, but at the same time, it was also a huge relief. Around the same time as we were planning for Shark Tank, we also had to decide if we were going to do a formal company launch the following January at the Consumer Electronics Show. And when Shark Tank fell through, the pressure to do CES really grew exponentially. So we had to switch focus again and get ready to demonstrate a product we still hadn't built. So once again, we found ourselves trying to build some version of the product on an accelerated timeline. And by the time the show rolled around, we had something working pretty well. And with a little sleight of hand, we were able to demonstrate it. And despite the scramble, the show went really well. Wayzn was featured on several best of show lists, and it won a number of honors, including an Editor's Choice Award from USA Today, a CES Innovation Award, and the CTA Smart Home Mark of Excellence Award for Emerging Technology. About halfway through the 9-hour drive back home from Vegas, however, I started feeling sick. And I was out for days because it seems like I got COVID at CES and unknowingly helped spread it to the Bay Area. Sorry for that. At the time, we didn't know what the pandemic would mean for our business, so we just kept pressing on. Our Indiegogo backers had been waiting for months, and we were under incredible pressure to get the product shipped. Um, and knowing that we could still change software after we shipped, but we would be stuck with the hardware, we poured most of our effort into getting the physical product right. Once it was ready, we started shipping, even though the software was really still not where it should have been in terms of completeness or quality. So we went from taking heat about shipping to taking heat about shipping a partially finished product. Um, we we had done it at least, and we started shipping. And the good news is we got that done before the global supply chain started to falter. So that was really a big win. But the joy of shipping was short-lived as concerns about the product started coming in, and the feedback was pretty mixed. It quickly became apparent that this thing was not ready for prime time, and no way could we start selling it for $400 until we fixed some of the software issues. So this is what I was referring to earlier. We had already shipped the product, but here we were still working on what I really consider the core basic product. So we started speaking with customers every day to learn as much as we could about what we needed to fix, and this became the next sprint, which I'll just call quality. So here the risk equation had never been more clear. After everything we'd accomplished and everything we'd invested, we still faced the immediate risk of complete failure if customers didn't like the product. So no fancy math was required. We would, for this sprint, we didn't set a budget. We would just spend as much as we had to make this work at this point. We took we undertook multiple development sprints, and we pushed to improve the quality just as fast as we could with whatever resources we had. So this was really a period of a balancing act between cash flow and spending. We worked for months on the software, and some of the problems proved difficult to fix. Progress was slow, but even though we took more returns than expected, things did start to improve. I spoke with customers on a daily basis so I could learn as much as possible about what they liked and what they disliked. And despite all the problems with the product, we kept hearing generally favorable feedback. For a lot of customers, they were just so happy about the product when it worked that they were willing to overlook some quirky behavior. About 6 months after we started shipping, we conducted a survey and calculated our first Net Promoter Score. And if you're not already familiar with Net Promoter, this is a technique where you ask your customers to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how likely they are to recommend. And you subtract the percent who say 1 through 4 from the percent who say 9 or 10. A good score is above 40, and ours was 30. So we took stock again. We had spent more than we expected to get the product in the market, and customers didn't all love it. So we knew more work needed to be done. And it became clear that it wasn't just about software, but we had another potentially even more serious problem. You see, back when we were rushing to get it shipped, we ran into a snag that I haven't mentioned. Non-camera based motion detection can't see through glass. So in our initial vision for the product, it would be integrated with one or more third-party cameras. And this would make it possible to let the dog back in when the camera detected motion. But when we were building the product, we couldn't find a suitable camera partner in the time that we had available. And eventually we just gave up on it. So we had a workaround. You could use an Alexa-enabled camera with motion detection to trigger an Alexa routine with our skill to open the door. But for a large percentage of our customer base, that was just way too complex. These customers were telling us that we needed a simpler way to let the dog back in. They wanted a tag you could place on the dog's collar. So based on this input, we had to get to work immediately on the next product, which was really just going to be an accessory for the first one. We were going to do the whole thing again. And the risk equation was much more complicated this time around. We had other competing priorities. So with very limited resources, the opportunity cost of pressing ahead with the pet tag meant a delay in advancing Wayzn for Windows or Wayzn Delivery Box. So it was a difficult decision, but in the end, the the need for the pet tag was undeniable. And we're actually still in the middle of the pet tag product development process, and this kind of brings me to the end of our journey. This time around, we started with the software much earlier. It turns out to be a difficult technical challenge to measure proximity using radio signal strength, and we wanted to remove as much of the technical risk as early in the process as possible. So as a result, the software will actually be complete for the pet tag long before the product is manufactured. A totally different approach this time around. And when it finally ships, it should perform very well from day one. It's been development of the pet tag's been a smoother process. So far it's going pretty well, and we just started pre-sales. We'll be shipping it maybe sometime next year. We don't know when yet because of global supply chain issues. So I'm sure that's a common refrain. And we're still working on Wayzn delivery box, which opens automatically to receive packages when they're delivered. With each new product, I think we're getting better at using the just enough product development methodology. And we're thinking more about how we can reduce risk with less investment. We're trying to focus on what progress we can help the customer make. And we're more consistent in defining and using our messaging. For anyone who's interested, come see me in the booth. I'd be happy to share links with you for any of the tools or gear that I mentioned. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adam. I really appreciate it. And for everybody, there's a Wayzn booth has a dog door opener, the sliding glass door, and a dog.
Check it out.